Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So let me make sure I am up. I'm seeing green. I'm seeing myself moving and shaking. So I'm going to take it as if I am up. Let me check my sound before I start. It is good to be back. I'm going to say it that way. It's good to be back. It's so bizarre. It's so bizarre, like, to know that you have a channel and you can't use that particular channel. It feels fucking weird. It honestly felt like I was bastard sound. That's what I was checking. I use this analogy like I was a prison inmate. Like you get locked up and you get put in prison. It's like the man is keeping you down, and you get like a eye tattoo and everything like this, and you get out and you have more street cred because you were put in prison or something like that. It felt weird. It felt weird. I thought it was bogus, but it still felt weird. And so it feels nice to be back on my regular station, my regular channel. Just as a few announcements. I probably haven't did this in a while, but guys, I want to thank everybody for your donations. That's the first part, either Super Cash or PayPal. I also want to thank all of the patrons that contribute and follow the account. And whether people contribute or not, it's kind of besides the point. You guys make the channel. I mean, I can't necessarily have a chat if you don't necessarily have people to chat with. And I gotta be honest, I enjoy the live shows. Being able to interact with the audience is something I ended up enjoying. I don't necessarily know how other channels do their chat. So at least not before I did mine. I didn't necessarily know how other people did it. So I just did it with the way I thought was best. You interact with your audience, you guys are talking about a topic, and you go back and forth. I like that pattern, but that pattern purely depends on having an audience to actually have that conversation with. So let's fucking appreciate it. So if you like the videos, if you share the videos, if you didn't like the video but you still watched it, all of those things gets a thank you very much. You are absolutely appreciated. The second part to that is on Wednesday, Grant Cameron is going to be on the show and Hard Bastard is going to be on the show. Both of those should be damn good. So HB is more right of center. And HB, at least in the context of our conversation, is going to focus on this idea of censorship in media. He himself has been censored. He received a strike from YouTube himself, so he's also been on ice. He also has a prison tattoo on the side of his eye from being in YouTube jail. And so that should be a decent conversation. He analyzes the news, or at least media. He seems to focus more so on media constantly and about the BS that these guys put out sometimes. The other part to that is Grant Cameron, who I have to be honest, I am ecstatic for that interview. You have no idea. Of all the interviews that I think I've had, and I've enjoyed each and every one of them because there's something you can get from all of the interviews. I think this is the one where I myself am on cloud fucking 9 to have. So I am looking towards for both of those though, but the last one particularly. So I'm going to nail down the times for both of those. But both should be really good. So let's talk about the resistance. Let's talk about the resistance. This sorry sap of Democrats here, the bailout, they call them the bailout caucus. The bailout caucus has joined in with the Republican Party to deregulate Wall Street further. You heard that right. These guys have threw their lot in to deregulate Wall Street further. It's always weird to me because you think of all the things that are going on in the world. You know, you have, let me say it this way. I've interacted with people and just going about my typical day. You in this building, you're at work, you're at somewhere getting something to eat, whatever. And then perusing and interacting with people. This is Virginia, so people tend to be pretty talkative, and anybody talks to anybody in Virginia. You don't necessarily have to know the person. All sorts of things may come up. Insecurities, vulnerabilities, things about college, things about their education, things about their capacity to support their kids, maybe things that their kids want, maybe their kids have been an asshole. You have all of these things that makes up an individual life. You know what doesn't come up? You know what I've never heard anybody say? We need to fucking deregulate the banks. I've never heard anybody say that. I've yet to hear somebody tell me that, at least in the bottom 99%. I've yet to hear somebody come and says, dude, we really need to get with this deregulation shit. We've punished the banks too much. Pity the bankers. But for whatever reason, Democrats and Republicans, both of them feel as if that's what needs to take place. The wild part about this is, and I'm going to read through the docs, and I'm going to let you hear Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders rail against their fellow Democrats who are pushing this and who are falling in line for this. Chuck Schumer is acting as if Chuck Schumer has taken a public position that Chuck Schumer doesn't want to be a part of this. That's his public position. Chuck Schumer hasn't said shit about this. Meaning, if he wanted to filibuster, if he wanted to rally and push back against this, Chuck Schumer would have done that. Chuck Schumer didn't do squat. So, this is going to go through. And you're going to have Democrats to thank for allowing this to go through. This is your resistance, ladies and gentlemen. The beauty of this is, I am not shocked by this. It would take somebody to be blissfully unaware of the party to which they've affiliated with themselves with if you're going to be shocked that Democrats are obsequious to Wall Street. This is Podesta Leaks. WikiLeaks document. From Citigroup, John Podesta. A list of African Americans, Latino and Asian American candidates broken down by cabinet deputy and under assistant deputy assistant level, plus a list of Native Americans, Arab Americans, and disabled American candidates. They call it disabled Americans. Being disabled is not a race, asshole. We have much longer lists for most of the other groups. While you did not ask for this, I prepared and attached a similar document of women. Ain't that nice? At the risk of being presumptuous, I also scoped out how the cabinet level appointments might be put together. This guy from Citigroup that was advising Obama on who to put in his cabinet got, for all intents and purposes, those people put into Obama's cabinets. If you're shocked that the Democratic Party went along with this particular deregulation, if you honestly believe that the party is not for this regulation as much as Republicans are for this regulation, then you have not been paying attention. They literally picked the people who are going to be in Obama's staff, meaning the bank. This guy, the people who were in this document ended up being the people who Obama filled his staff with. Perhaps the most startling discovery in WikiLeaks dump so far didn't come from the most recent emails surrounding the various Hillary Clinton scandals, though there were many great ones, but from 2008 when John Podesta served as co-chair for the President-elect Obama's transition team. The email came from Michael Froman, a former Citibank executive who single-handedly built the entire cabinet of what was supposed to be the Main Street president. My point in this is, you shouldn't be surprised that these guys were in the tank for Wall Street. Let's keep going. Let's go through the legislation itself. Ultimately, what the legislation does, it deregulates the banks in a way by taking away their threshold for scrutiny. So instead of being like a $250 billion threshold, or I'm sorry, $50 billion, it takes it up to $250 billion, meaning the bank needs to have a certain amount of that threshold, otherwise the bank gets increased scrutiny. And let me read it just so I'm saying this accurately. This gets into a bit of financial lingo. This is New Republic. Everything wrong with the bill, everything wrong with the Democrats in one bill. The bipartisan push to roll back Dodd-Frank reveals minority party that can't get it right on policy or the politics. Now, Democrats currently are making the argument, the ones that are pushing it, that they're doing this for rural banks. That's why he's bringing this up. So this is a good point, because I'm going to read what the Democrats are saying, meaning the conservative Democrats, the bailout caucus, who are part of this. And I'm going to read what their response to this is, because the response is more right than what they are. Deregulating the banks or doing just about anything that suggests coziness with the banks has not exactly been a winning message in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. But 10 years later, a bipartisan bank deregulation bill that partly unravels Dodd-Frank is moving through the Senate with the support of every Republican and 17 Democrats. The resistance. What started off as an effort to relieve pressure on community banks and credit unions has morphed into a gift to the biggest banks in the country. Quite simply, if the bill passes, banks will get richer. The legislation raises the threshold that triggers increased oversight from the Federal Reserve from $50 billion in assets to $250 billion in assets, freeing more than a dozen banks from stricter rules. It also exempts more banks from the Volcker rule, which curbs their ability to make speculative bets with their own money and reduces the amount of capital they need to keep on hand. So if I'm reading this right, I guess it's beforehand, it used to be they used to have $50 billion in assets to $250 billion in assets. No. The legislation raises the threshold that triggers increased oversight from the Federal Reserve from $50 billion to $250 billion. Oh, you need to have $250 billion in assets in order to have oversight. So you have a bunch of banks. That's not a tiny fucking bank. $50 billion is not a tiny bank. I'm sorry, that is not a tiny bank. And they've upped this to 250, meaning all of these other banks can skate. Under 250 billion will be able to skate. This started off for community banks. $250 billion is not a community bank. Let's keep going. In exchange, a financial crisis will become more likely. The Congressional Budget Office reported that the probability of systemically important banks failing is small under the current law and would be slightly greater under the legislation. The 17 Democrats who are supporting the bill have basically shrugged at this possibility, arguing that the bill is a boost for small banks, small businesses, and consumers. We're not doing this to help the banks. We're doing this to help you. We're in it for you. Indeed, Dodd-Frank has caused headaches for some middle-class people who have struggled to secure loans or mortgage because of the strictures. But the deregulation bill goes well beyond technical fixes. Barney Frank, the since-retired Democrat who co-wrote Dodd-Frank, he's the Frank in Dodd-Frank, has said the threshold should be closer to $125 billion. As many have noted, the systemically destructive countrywide financial institution had less than $250 billion assets when it collapsed during the crisis. That's important. Understand what's being said. The bank that started all this, I don't know how many people were around when that took place. I mean, I would imagine most people here would have been around. You guys probably have a little more age on you. But when it crashed, they're making the point that the bank that crashed, that took everything down, that started this kind of this domino effect, had less than $250 billion in assets. They're trying to change the legislation to be higher than what the failure was. Meaning, if you know that, say, for example, this bank failed at $200 billion, then why are you putting in a law where you're making it $250 billion when you already know that you have a proof positive case of something that took place at a lesser amount than that? They've increased the threshold above the point where the prior thing took place. They're right. That's amazing. You would think that they would have, at the very least, keep it at the level to which Countrywide failed. Not so much. Not so much. As David Dayton has reported, mega banks like Citigroup are eager to lift capital requirements so they can engage in more risk. There aren't just many reasonable policy justifications for these generous provisions. There aren't a lot of political justifications either. And going along with the bill that fulfills a number of long-standing Republican priorities and very few Democratic ones, Democrats are displaying a profound incoherence leading into the midterm elections. This is bizarre on so many fronts. Like, even if you were in the tank for the banks, which I believe these guys are, even if you were in the tank for the banks, don't they know that this is somewhat politically toxic? Like, they're betting that in Republican states that Donald Trump got in office, that this will make them look good in those states. I don't know why they believe that supporting a bill that deregulated the banks is going to somehow look good on their record. But that is what they're literally betting on, and that's what they're running on in this case. I think that's an amazing position, but okay. The 17 Democrats who voted for the bill to proceed on Tuesday are either centrist or facing re-election in states that Donald Trump won in 2016. They have defended the bill on the merits, arguing that it will free up credit in rural areas and that's an overdue fix for Dodd-Frank's flaws. There's also a sense among Democrats that it may very well be the best deal they can get on Dodd-Frank reform. But it's also clear that they're supporting the bill for performative reasons, hoping to show voters back home that Congress can do more than just bicker and that Democrats are willing to work with Republicans to get things done. This is old school legislating. South Dakota Democrat Heidi Heitkamp told Politico. Now, the wild part about this is the guy, he kills us. He says, but it's not really old school legislating. If it were, Democrats would participate in give and take with Republicans. There would be parts of the bill that you could point to as significant to Democratic wins. But as it stands, the bill is a giveaway to the banking industry in which consumers get very little. Even though it may make it easier for some consumers to get loans, that comes with the trade-off of a weakened financial regulatory system and fewer consumer protections. While the bill's backers have highlighted a number of fig leaf protections, most notably the ability to temporarily freeze one's credit for up to a year, these are overshadowed by the bill's regulatory rollbacks, which disproportionately benefit banks and puts consumers at risk. The bill, moreover, violates one of the key tenets of Dodd-Frank, according to the Center for American Progress, regulating financial products not based on merely who offers them, but also on what the products do. For a home buyer, the size of the originating bank should not determine whether or not he or she obtains a fair deal in the mortgage. He's making this argument that, look, whatever the Democrats think they're going to get a trade-off on this, it's insane to believe that people are out there believing that they want Democrats to fight for the banks. And I agree with him on this. This seems an insane prospect. I don't know anybody on either side of the spectrum that is saying to themselves, these fucking political leaders, if only they went out there and fought harder for the banks. That's what we need. We need somebody who's going to go out there and fight for the banks. We want more than just getting them to choose whoever is in Obama's camp and to prevent themselves from being locked up for tanking the economy. Let's keep going. What's so bewildering about this is that blocking the bill would be politically valuable to Democrats. Yes, I agree. Deregulating banks at the time when Republican president is constantly touting the economy's performance is nonsensical. In the right hands, it could show how beholden Republicans are to moneyed interests. After passing a $1.5 trillion package for corporations and the wealthy, Republicans are making it easier for banks to take on the kinds of risks that nearly destroy the financial system. The bill could be a neat encapsulation of a corrupt administration and an out-of-touch Republican Party. Instead, it has become a totem of feckless and incompetent Democratic Party. I can't argue with the man. He's right. And to add more context to this, this is Common Cause. Kurt Walters, campaign director at Demand Progress Grassroots and anti-corruption wing Root Striker, has said 17 members of the Democratic caucus who voted to advance the bill in the Senate have simply no defense. No defense. Now, those Democrats are putting up a defense. They're saying that we're trying to help you and banks and businesses, small businesses. We need you to believe they're small businesses. The reality of it is they're allowing the much larger banks to skate, and they're weakening regulations on those banks. Understanding that in the weakening of the regulations, nobody's calling for this. That's the first point. Even if you were calling for it, you wouldn't call for it to this degree. That's the second point. And they're not getting anything for it. They're not getting anything for it. Let's keep going. Voters have seen this movie before. It didn't work out in 2008, and it's no wiser today. There is simply no excuse for Democrats to add their name to Wall Street deregulation. Walters said following the vote, identifying members who voted in favor as the bailout caucus. He said those lawmakers have now sent a very clear message. I work for my bank donors, not my constituents. And of course, I'm going to show you Sanders, his speech, and I'm going to show you Elizabeth Warren's speech. So I'm not going to read their other parts. But I do want to read one more part to this. And it's not though Democrats were holding their noses in order to obtain some higher or more noble goal. Not only bad policy itself, critics pointed out, that Democrats who voted in favor of it got absolutely nothing to leverage their votes. They couldn't pass this thing without Democrats. They couldn't pass it without Democrats. And instead of getting something for them doing this, even if they said, fuck, fair enough, we'll do this, but we want X, Y, Z out of it. What did they get out of it? You gave Republicans their wish list. You gave them, for the most part, everything that they wanted. And you weakened the legislation that the prior president put into effect. You're a Democratic president, mind you. Put into effect. Good job. Good job. The bailout caucus, ladies and gentlemen, the resistance. Considering the crash of 2008 and recognizing the more recent scandals at Wells Fargo, Equifax, and other financial institutions, Bartlett Naylor, a financial policy analyst with Public Citizen, argued ahead of the vote that Democrats and other lawmakers in the Senate should be fighting for tougher Wall Street rules, not rolling the bat to pay back wealthy corporate donors. Naylor said the support the deregulatory package has received thus far from the Democrats is an ugly reflection of Wall Street's political clout in both parties, purchased through billions in political spending over many decades. Naylor specifically called out the vote of U.S. Tim Kaine, the former vice presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. Kaine, co-sponsoring the bill, lamenting Naylor, shows that too many Democratic politicians remain far too close to the financial sector. Even more concerning are press reports that the bill's supporters could benefit financially from its passage. The resistance. The resistance. As you can expect, Sanders didn't necessarily like this. Elizabeth Warren has been, she's been an animal on this particular point. But I've always said Elizabeth Warren has a grievance against a banker, man. I don't quite understand it. I don't know if they took her lollipop as a kid. I don't know if they kicked over her stroller. I don't know what they did, but they've pissed her off and she has this thing in her head. It's like a fetish. There's another part to this that I want to show that I found damn interesting, if I can find it. Yeah, Politico. All right, so Politico went to the more conservative Democrats to get their perspective of this. Democrats who helped draft the bill argued the legislation is an overdue recalibration of Dodd-Frank that would help make it easier for small and mid-sized banks to provide credit, particularly in rural areas. That is true, but that doesn't really say anything for the bigger banks. I understand if you're saying that for smaller banks, but you've given away the farm. You've given away everything, including completely undermining the legislation. The point of the legislation was to make it difficult for banks to go bust. You've made it easier for banks to go bust. And you've got nothing for it. You've got nothing for it. For those senators driving the legislation, including Heitkamp, John Tester, Joe Donnelly, and Mark Warner, it is an opportunity to show that things can still get done in a bitterly divided Congress. Right there. Right there. Things can still get done. What kind of things are you getting done, though? And is that really the only message that you want to send? You're willing to fuck over your constituents just to send the message that, hey, we can agree with Republicans on really nasty shit when it supports Wall Street. The senators on Tuesday praised banking chairman Mike Crapo of Idaho for working with them to make the legislation a reality, despite the fact that many in the GOP want to enact more sweeping rollbacks of financial regulation. This is old school legislating, Heitkamp said. The thing that amazes me about this is Republicans would go for pretty much everything in this bill. What do you mean old school legislating? You gave them everything that they wanted. It seems like her argument here is they wanted more than what we gave them. That is not the same thing. Like, it's one thing if you and I are having a conversation and I am angling for something. There's something that I want. Say, for example, DACA. Say I don't want these kids kicked out. If I'm negotiating with that, then that's the thing that I'm pivoting around. That's the thing that I actually want. If we end up with a legislation, me arguing at the end of this that these guys wanted a lot more and I didn't give them as much as they wanted, this is some kind of a win for me. This is old school legislating by them getting everything that they want and me getting nothing of this. If that's old school legislating, it's no wonder why you guys lose so much. But for Warren, it was an example of everything wrong with Washington. She accused her colleagues of backing the legislation because of years of sustained bank lobbying in the wake of Dodd-Frank's enactment. And by the way, Warren is right about that. Before Dodd-Frank was even, before the ink was even dry, they were working on a bill to unravel Dodd-Frank, or at the very least roll back some of the provisions of Dodd-Frank. Let's take a look at Warren's response, because you can imagine, like I said, Warren has this fetish for punching bankers. So I'm going to let her talk about this first when this came up early. This was a month or two ago when she's talking about this particular bill. I'm going to fast forward to her talking about it. I think it was either today or yesterday. And I'm going to forward a little bit of Sanders. So
Mr. Chairman, I call up Amendment 54. This amendment strikes Section 401 of the bill, which rolls back rules and oversight of some of the biggest banks in the country. I will not be requesting a vote on this amendment, but it is shocking that Congress is on the path to deregulating these institutions. Less than a decade ago, the 28 banks that are deregulated by this part of the bill sucked down more than $47 billion in taxpayer bailout money. $47 billion from our constituents' pockets. And now, Democrats are teaming up with Republicans to reverse the rules that we put in place in 2010 to make sure that these banks wouldn't need to be bailed out again. These are not community banks. Each one of them has up to $250 billion in assets. Everyone in this room has probably heard of every name on this list. SunTrust, which got nearly $5 billion in bailout money. Regions Bank, which got $3.5 billion in bailouts. BB&T, which got more than $3 billion in bailouts. Comerica, which got more than $2 billion in bailouts. Altogether, $47 billion in bailouts to the banks that you now want to deregulate because the Fed said if you let those banks fail, they will bring down the entire economy. And this bill now eases regulatory burdens on those banks. Over the last few years, we have heard testimony from experts that deregulating these banks would be dangerous. The failure of a single bank with $250 billion in assets could destabilize the financial system. And in a time of stress, it is likely to be more than one of these banks that goes down simultaneously. The downside of rolling back these rules is enormous. I hear Senator Kennedy say he's not opposed to big, he's opposed to dumb. Well, I'm opposed to dangerous. It is potentially losing out on the chance to stop another crisis before it starts. And meantime, the upside is tiny. Banks that are already highly profitable might get out from underneath some relatively small amount of compliance costs, money that is more likely to go to stock buybacks or executive compensation, not to additional loans anyway. How can we say that banks that required billions of dollars in taxpayer bailouts are not worth keeping a close eye on 10 years later? How can we possibly have forgotten the lesson of the financial crisis already? Isn't it better to be safe than sorry and cast a wider net when it comes to protecting the financial system and ensuring that our constituents don't have to bail out these banks a second time?
I agree with her. She's right. You're going to give these guys all their money because they're going to bring down the entire economic system. And you understand, we lost trillions of dollars in that. We lost trillions. You have people who lost their entire savings, who lost their lives, their marriages, and everything else with the stress that was taking place. She's not insane. And beyond all of that, it's still this weird question of who's clamoring for this? Who's clamoring for this? And who are you actually supposed to be representing? And for all of the issues that address or that affect us, all of us as human beings, or let's say the 99% of us, are any of us clamoring for deregulation for Wall Street? The question I'm asking here is, who do they actually represent if this is the stuff that comes up on the menu? If these are the things that these guys can find bipartisanship agreement on, who is it that they actually represent? Let's keep going. I continuously make this argument that it's not one or the other. It's both. Both parties are the problem. Both parties are beholden to the same interests. You don't have two political systems. You have one political system that, for the most part, have two wings of, for all intents and purposes, the exact same party. Let's keep going. I want to hear Warren talk about this today because I like how she started this, because I think she brings it home or makes it very clear with, you understand, you know, it was like X amount of years ago, like a decade ago, the system fell apart. And these guys are pushing through legislation to allow that to take place once again.
Good morning. So here we are. It is nearly 10 years to the day since we first learned that the big banks were crashing the American economy. Instead of learning from the lessons of the 2008 crash, Congress is getting ready to pass the biggest financial deregulation bill in decades. And I want to talk today about 3 ways that that's dangerous. First, this bill hurts consumers. It makes it easier for banks once again to offer risky home loans to consumers that can't afford them. You know, leading up to the 2008 crisis, banks were selling mortgages that were like grenades with the pins pulled out. And now the supporters of the bill want to strip back some of the rules designed to stop that from happening all over again. This bill also undermines civil rights protections. At a time when lending discrimination is running rampant, this bill would undercut reporting requirements that enable the federal government to enforce fair lending laws. The bill makes it easier to cheat people who purchase manufactured homes. And the bill lets lenders make lives a lot more miserable for one reason only, so that lenders can make bigger profits. Second, in addition to hurting consumers directly, this deregulatory bill puts our entire economy at risk. It takes banks with up to $250 billion in assets. That's about 25 of the 40 largest banks in the country off the watch list for more federal oversight. These are...
Just to make a slight point for that, the other Democrats were making this argument that they're talking about rural banks. And that's how they were justifying it. Well, we're talking about rural banks. We're trying to help rural banks. We're trying to help these things. $250 billion. That's $250 billion. That's a massive amount of cash. That is not a rural bank. That's all I'm saying. When you hear Heidi Heitkamp making this point of this is old style politics and we're doing this for rural banks and lending and all this other stuff, nothing further couldn't be further from the truth. Let's let her finish. There's a section of this. I think it's about a minute left of this.
Are the same banks that got nearly $50 billion in taxpayer bailout money during the crash, and no one went to jail. Remember Countrywide? Countrywide was the bank that was at the heart of the crash. At its peak, Countrywide was issuing 1 out of every 5 mortgages in the country. And you know what those mortgages did. Those were the mortgages with the teaser rates. Those were the mortgages with all the tricks and traps built into the fine print. And those are the mortgages that helped blow up the financial system. You know how big Countrywide was when it was creating all this risk in the financial system? It was about $200 billion, which is smaller than some of the banks that would be deregulated by this bill. If this bill passes, the next Countrywide will be regulated as if it were some tiny little community bank. That's staggeringly dangerous for the American economy. In fact, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released its score of the bill just last night, and the CBO found that the bill would increase the chances of a big bank failing, that it would put taxpayers on the hook for millions in additional costs. According to the CBO, this bill increases the chances of another bailout. Third, I want to highlight a provision in this bill that hasn't gotten much attention in the last few weeks, but it literally applies only to the dozen biggest banks in the country, including J.P. Morgan and Citi. The bill changes just one word. It says the Fed shall tailor the rules for the biggest banks instead of may tailor the rules. Now, that one word change will allow the big banks to sue the Fed if they don't weaken the rules the way the banks want. And that pressure on the Fed will lead to a systematic weakening of the rules for all the big banks. This may be the single most dangerous provision in the bill, and it applies only to the biggest Wall Street banks.
Yeah, the whole rural bank thing, I wouldn't necessarily believe. And a few minutes of Sanders, because Sanders I think Sanders is making the argument in the way that I think about the argument, or the way I process it. It's like, who's clamoring for this? Who the fuck are you in Washington for? Now, nobody in their right mind, I guarantee you, none of these guys' constituents, talking about people, not talking about banks, or not talking about their business associates or people who are putting money in their pockets, but none of those people are clamoring, sending these guys letters saying, we need you to deregulate the banks. Of all issues that plague us as human beings, all of our weaknesses and foibles and vulnerabilities and everything else, does deregulating the banks, does that really get that much a priority where these guys can come together in this kind of kumbaya with their chest hair in the sun and pass this legislation? Let's hear Sanders. Let's hear Sanders. This is Sanders in his element. So,
floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I get around my own state of Vermont a lot, and in fact, I get around the country a lot. And I hear from a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of people about what's on their minds. And needless to say, in these very complicated and difficult times, there is a lot that the American people are concerned about. They are concerned about gun violence, and they want strong legislation to be passed as soon as possible to protect their kids and the American people. They want legislation overwhelmingly. Over 80% of the American people, in poll after poll, want legislation to protect the 1.8 million young people who are eligible for the DACA program. That's what people talk about. People talk about the high cost of health care, and they talk about the fact that they cannot afford prescription drugs because the drug companies are ripping us off every single day. And they talk about climate change and their fear about what kind of planet we're going to be leaving our kids and our grandchildren if we don't transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. And the people that I talk to in Vermont and throughout the country talk about our crumbling infrastructure. They talk about the need for decent paying jobs. They talk about the high cost of college education. Just talked to a nurse the other day in Wisconsin, tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, a teacher, not a nurse. A teacher in Wisconsin with tears in her eyes cannot afford to send her own daughter to college. And I talk every day, it seems, to young people who graduate college $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 in debt and are worried about how that debt will impact the rest of their lives. And I talk to people in Vermont and around the country about the child care crisis that we have, and about lack of affordable housing, and about a million other issues that are on the minds of people in Arizona and Vermont and all across this country. But I can honestly say that I have not heard one person come up to me and say, Bernie, we have got to deregulate 25 of the largest banks in this country with cumulative assets of $3.5 trillion. No one has ever come up to me and said that that is a major priority for the American people. No one has ever suggested to me that instead of talking this week and moving forward on gun safety legislation or the DACA issue or the high cost of prescription drugs, that we should be down here on the floor talking about the needs of some of the largest banks in this country. But that is precisely what the Senate will be discussing this week and probably next week as well. Mr. President, if you want to know why the American people in very, very strong numbers hold the United States Congress in contempt, it is precisely because we have a Republican leadership that does exactly the opposite of what the American people want. And it's not just not dealing with the DACA issue or dealing with the gun violence issue. Over the last year, despite the overwhelming objections of the American people, Republican leadership tried to throw some 32 million Americans off of health insurance. Thank God we were able to beat that back. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, the American people do not believe that the Koch brothers and other billionaires should receive massive tax breaks. That's exactly what the Republican leadership provided. And on it goes. The needs of the middle class and working families are ignored, while the needs of the wealthy and powerful, including Wall Street, are addressed. And today, my Republican colleagues, along with some Democrats, tell us that what we should be doing right now is spending our time on deregulating some of the largest banks in America. How absurd is that? Not gun violence, not the DACA crisis, not the high cost of prescription drugs, not 30 million people without health insurance, but deregulating some of the largest banks in America.
Yeah, I process it the same way. I process it the same way. If you honestly want to look at the world and you want to figure out what are the priorities of the people who are in your political system, what do they focus their energies on? What can they actually get accomplished when they want to get shit accomplished? If you want to kill somebody, they can do it. If you want to give the banks more cash, they can do it. If you want to give some kind of tax breaks or tax cuts, they can do it. They can do it. So I think these guys are right. But at the end of the day, you're resistance, ladies and gentlemen. Working with Republicans to bend over backwards for Wall Street interests. It's more than 12. It's 17. It's 17. Let's see who we got here. Money Chain, let's support you more. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it. And Brahm, thank you, Brahm. Thanks, guys. Thank you. I appreciate it. Mick Resistance, baby, to Mosi Young. That's funny. J. Scott, Schumer, Pelosi are not the resistance. They seem to think they are. At least that's what they're screaming all the time. Yvonne Legolis, no, not shocked. Wasn't shocked at Obama either, especially. Well, you're better than me on that one. I was shocked with the Obama thing. I believed it. That was before my political awareness. I was like, oh, wow, this guy is going to be the next FDR, and he's black. It's even better. Not so much. Not so much. This is why we have Trump. This is exactly why we have Trump. Think about it. I mean, one of the most damaging aspects of the WikiLeaks was Hillary Clinton's speeches to Wall Street. It was her speeches to Wall Street, because it gave across this impression, not an impression, I mean, it got across this idea of who her actual interest was. If you're having a conversation with them and you're telling them that, yeah, I sometimes need to label my position to the public. If you're telling them that, that's your real position. Like, I guess, if that makes sense. If you're saying, I have to tell them sometimes, meaning the outside world things, that's not necessarily true, because it wouldn't necessarily jive with what I'm telling you right now. Well, it gets across her actual interest. It wasn't us. Not surprised. Not surprised. I know some people are. Not surprised. My argument remains the same. For all intents and purposes, both of these guys are beholden to the same interests. And until you're staying, if you stay with the same model, you're going to get the same thing. Until you're willing to say, no, I'm not supporting that. For example, Joe Manchin is going along with this. Are there going to be lefties who are going against Joe Manchin? Or are they going to say, you need to vote in Joe Manchin? I'm making this point. There's no such thing as accountability if you're so terrified of Republicans that the Democrat can do whatever he wants. If these guys get to do this and get a pass on it, then there's no such thing as accountability in the political process. It's amazing. They're selling the rest of the country down the river for their own political ends. And not even just their political ends. They may actually agree with this stuff. They may actually agree. And I got to be honest, I guess I'm more cynical than this. I don't think they're doing this purely for political ends. I think they just agree. Not just think they just agree. I think the problem with this for them is the optics, not necessarily the legislation itself. I would even wager that Chuck Schumer and the Democrats shuffled up who would be for it to let this thing pass. Meaning, who's going to take the hit? Who can I allow to lay low? Or who do I need or allow to actually let this slide? Meaning the people who went for it. I mean, I'm saying this poorly. Chuck Schumer comes out and doesn't necessarily come down. He says he's against it. Publicly, he's against it. Publicly, he's against it. He's not rallying anybody to go against the bill itself. He's letting the legislation pass. He's not filibustering the legislation. He's not necessarily behaving like somebody who's actually against a particular piece of legislation. That's what I'm getting at. Regardless of what the public position is, they seem to be perfectly on board with allowing this to go through, regardless of the political optics. Don't get me wrong, Sanders, yeah, I don't think he wants to go through. He just calls himself a goddamn socialist. Elizabeth Warren, again, she has a fetish for punching bankers in the throat, so no, she's not going to want to go through. But the party as a whole, do you honestly believe that the party as a whole is not beholden to the same plutocratic interest that allows them to raise massive amounts of cash for their campaigns? Of course it is. The argument that these guys were making, saying that these guys were bribed from years and years and years of being watered with money and lobbying from Wall Street donors, yeah, it feathers a nice fluffy bit. Oh, I love this. Brendan P. Democrats are still in bed with Wall Street. Shocker. I was saying nice cozy bed at the exact same time I read that. Rob Illinois. Warren just screams and that's it. Nothing but hollow words. Yes and no. I think Warren is more complicated. So it's like, this is a bad analogy, but I think it gets across. I think it may get across. It's like Dick Cheney, even though he's a Republican, he's okay with gays because his daughter was gay. Like this is her thing. This is her specific thing. This is her bellwether. It's like, you know where she's going to go on these type of directions, regardless of what takes place. She's always pretty strong on this one very specific point. So she can scream, but I think on this one she actually has bite. Everything else, fair weather. Fair weather friend. Everything else is just totally fair weather. Warren is correct on this policy. Yeah, she is. She is. Agreed. That's why I played her. Let's see. What is this? Mikey Mike, the Russian bot. A fetish for punching bankers in the throat. She does. Have you? I mean, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That was her baby. That was her brainchild. If you've seen her crucify these bankers when she drags these guys in front of Congress, that is her thing. Like, that's her. That's the bee in her bonnet. I don't necessarily trust her for other stuff because I think she goes with political wins. On bankers, yes, she seems earnest. She seems earnest. It's like Rand Paul. It's like Ron Paul. Yeah, it's like Rand Paul with drugs. That's a better example than Dick Cheney. The way Rand Paul would be batshit crazy on some of this other stuff, but on not putting all these people in prison for personal choice. Yeah, he's rock solid. He's rock solid. Not getting us into stupid, baseless wars. Yeah, he's rock solid. The other stuff, yeah, not so much. Not so much. Independent outsider, don't blame you. He shouldn't have given in like that and should have provided a better solution. Zox Alex, Hillary is a pocket puppet filled with affluenza cream. That sounds extremely gross, but I know what you're trying to get at. It just sounds funny. Let's see. Jim Hayden, 43% of those approaching retirement at 65 have no retirement savings. Yeah, I know. And Social Security maxes at $1,200 a month. Elderly living in public destitution. Yeah. 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 Fletcher Daniels. And Bernie and Warren have moments of honesty, but then they acquiesce over pro-war policies. It makes it hard to trust future decisions by them for our well-being. Yeah, I agree with that, right? They're politicians. Like, I mean, regardless of what I think of Sanders or Warren, they're politicians. I can't see them as anything else. Meaning they're going to be stuck with political wins that we don't necessarily see and we don't necessarily encounter. I can't always put myself in his direct spot. Nobody can. It's just being a person. You're external from the thing. You're observing something else. You're an observer. That being said, I accept that if he's doing something, he's probably doing something because he feels compelled that he needs to do it. Like, I don't think he's going to do it if he doesn't think he has to. So, yeah, there's some of the stuff I don't particularly like. My issue here, look, I don't think this is as simple as do you trust or distrust Sanders or Warren on this. I think it's more along the lines of do you trust more particular issues. Let me say it that way. I think left to Sanders' own devices, I think Sanders will probably, he will of course be to the left of Democrats. And I do think he means it. So I don't think it's one of those things where he's making shit up. I think he actually means it. Now, that being said, whether he means it or not, he still sees himself in a political arena, meaning he has to negotiate all of these other political ends, knowing full well that a lot of people greatly dislike him, particularly in the Democratic Party. They need him, but they hate his guts. They need him, but they hate his guts. He makes them look extremely bad. Why is this guy out there talking about, you know, not taking donations from billionaires and plutocrats, not actually doing policies that affect the public? It's like, why is this guy actually trying to get government to do things? Why is he doing that? Why is he doing that? He's making us look bad. I won't say how old I am. YouTube records and exposes the chat now, and they already expose enough of my personal information. I want to see Warren fight pipelines, then I'll listen. I would have loved to see Warren say something about Standing Rock. Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Let's see. Copter Force, Brom, I hear you that Elizabeth Warren has her downsides, but how the hell is she just supposed to put these fuckers in jail? Easier said than done. Yeah, you need political will to do that. Like, look, it's one thing, the bank crashes, fair enough. And everything is fresh, everybody is raw, everybody's pissed off. You have all these people that lost all of this money, all of their savings. You have one country after the next that starts to tank. Based on this cancerous process that these guys were using here in the United States to make more cash. They were being risky just for the sake of being risky. They wanted to make more money. If you're filing a lawsuit, you come in as the next administration, it makes perfect sense to investigate that. Like, it makes perfect sense to say, with all of the damage that took place in our world economy, we need to figure out what took place, what happened. Not just go after, you know, the end result. What happened? Nobody did that. Now, the catch to this is it possible that the reason why nothing like that took place is because Wall Street has greased so many palms and so many hands that nobody would do it? Understand what's taking place. Wall Street does not have the greatest reputation on the planet. The people, the American public, like Sanders said, I agree with him. They feel that these guys are beholden to special interests. That they're beholden to the people who put money in their pockets for their campaigns, who allow them this kind of revolving door process. When they get out of politics, they have somewhere to go. Or at the very least, toes a particular line, not wanting money to be used against them or somebody else to be replacing them. The American public already thinks that. The opinion of Washington is like 10, 12%. It's some abysmal number. That number didn't get there for no reason. And the number got there because people believe these people are not in their interests. Sanders is making a damn good point. You guys are pushing through this bipartisan legislation as if this is somehow a good thing. The American public, your constituents, the people who you are supposed to be here representing, have a litany of issues. Deregulating Wall Street is not on that list. What the fuck are you doing? And who the fuck are you really working for? Yeah, he's right. He's totally right. Moni G. What's happening, Moni G? Wall Street owns both major political parties. They have for decades. Not just Wall Street, pretty much anybody who can put money in their pockets. Too bad JT misses my sock puppet comments. Yeah, it's fleeting through, so I get some I don't. Moni G, glad tidings. JT, so good to see you back. Yeah, where you blog. Thank you for your Thoughtful opinions and thought-provoking commentary. Love your channel. Great guests too. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I send out requests for guests all the time. Yeah, I send out requests all the time. Yeah. Brom SL1. The bank CEOs broke the fucking law. I know that because I worked for one of these banks. Until one of them goes to jail, I'm staying with the Green Party. You're going to live your entire life with the Green Party, man. Unless there's something different. Unless there's something different. Lorms SL1 Brom, not calling for prison would be an action. Elizabeth Warren is so good at action. That's not her strength. Independent outsider. Sanders is a pragmatist with leftist ideas. Drives us all nuts. Yeah. I think that's what it is, Rob. I think that's exactly what it is. I think from Sanders' standpoint, I'm taking the pragmatic choice. Now, everybody else is like, dude, why are you in this party? Why are you in this party? They're fucking you over constantly. Why are you in this party? And now the party that you went out there and supported, that you stomped for, socialists, they cheated you, you stomped for them. And now the exact same party that you've affiliated yourself with is passing a rollback to the Dodd-Frank legislation. Oh, man. Yeah, he may consider himself a pragmatist. I would imagine he gets embarrassed tremendously by shit like this. Because ultimately he's affiliated with himself with these guys. And, you know, they're doing shit like this. It's open, it's overt, even though they may think they're getting political points for it. Who knows? I'm slightly skeptical of the political points thing. I'm more inclined to believe that this is just what they wanted to do. People always look for the political reasons that people do things. Sometimes it's, these guys are going to make sure that I am greased extremely well. I may even profit from this myself. Yeah, I'm pushing it through. Let's be honest. I mean, again, let's not be fooled that these guys are not in the pockets of moneyed interests. They are. Jim Hayden. Thank you, man. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it a lot. Fletcher Daniels. And if they keep shape-shifting their standards, then the metric is a waste and no trust is established. Who's shape-shifting standards? No, I mean, you mean Democrats? This is their standards. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. My argument has consistently been the party doesn't change unless it has a reason to change. If there is nothing acting against it, then nothing's going to take place. If they can always just point to the other guy and say, Trump, he's going to eat your babies. You got to vote for whatever this person did. Just got to ignore it and just vote for somebody other than Trump. They do that for a reason. I mean, that's essentially their gameplay. That's their strategy. That's the only thing they really got at this point. But I guess my point here is, if you can continuously do that, that means that you can never really hold the person accountable. Ultimately, that person can get elected over and over and over again. And the argument is always, the Republican is a fucking maniac, so you have to vote for this corporate conservative Democrat that in no way represents your interests. I mean, it's like, come on. If you want something to change, those people have to have the potential to lose. And those people need to be able to be punished for their failures. This is a failure. All these people should be taken out of office. I'm stocked on ramen when the next crash comes. You've been stocking up on ramens. You know, one of the things that they said in this that I thought was really interesting, she's right. I think it was Elizabeth Warren that said it. These guys are getting a massive tax cut. They're going to get like $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion tax cuts. And those tax cuts are going to go to the top 1% predominantly. Taxes are going to be raised on us later on, in which case they're going to increase taxes on the poor and the middle class in order to pay for those tax cuts that are going for the rich. The little kickback that people are getting now, they may see it in the short term. In the long term, that money is going to, you're not going to see that money for long. The lion's share of that, I think it's like almost like 90%, is going towards the top 1%. So I'm trying to get this across. Like the amount of money that they're talking about, they're going to get a massive tax cut on that. When rich get tax cuts, they put that money in their pockets. They don't increase their spending. It's not like you getting a check from the government and you're barely making ends meet as is. You're one of the 60% that don't have $500 to their name. You spend that money the moment that you get your money, your hands on that cash. In fact, you spend more than 100% when you get that money back. That money goes back into the economy itself. You spend the money that you get because you don't necessarily have huge amounts of cash. You're living from margins to margins. These guys aren't living anywhere near the margins. That number is just a digit in their bank account. And one, they're not going to all that much care about. They see the number go up. They may like the fact that the number goes up, but it's not going to change their spending habits or behaviors any particular way. They're going to put that money in their pocket. They're going to say thank you. Or they're going to put that money into the stock market, which is kind of my point. Elizabeth Warren is making the case that all of the tax money that these guys got, a large share of that is going to go into stocks and bonds and those type of things. Those things are going to dramatically inflate the price of stocks, meaning the stock market itself is going to make these things more likely to crash or more likely to collapse. The instruments that these banks are going to be using, I think her point is a lot of this money is not necessarily going to go into building jobs and new companies and everything else. It's going to go into fiscal and financial instruments. That money is going to make the system much more likely to collapse or much more likely to be unstable. Yeah, man, I agree with her, man. This is just bad. It's just bad. T Badger, or what's your Jane Hathaway? Poor Jane Hathaway. Uh-oh, what did Jane Hathaway say? I'll gladly pay an extra $20 on my taxes for everyone to have the same amount to run, and maybe only 2 weeks to do it in. Yeah, Moni, you're talking about finance elections, public finance elections. I think most people would. I think to the man. Because most people, the overwhelming majority of the people in the public understands the cancerous effect of money in politics. Yeah, those people, if they had the option, they would say, yes, I would give an extra $5 on my taxes or extra $10 on my taxes, and we have public finance elections. Most people would do it. Most people in the public would do it. The politician himself, probably not. Understand these people want differential advantage, meaning they want some way for them to have some kind of advantage in the process. If you're a candidate that has the capacity to raise more cash because of star power or something else, or better advertising, or maybe you have more backers and more cash, then you yourself are probably going to be against this thing of them taking money out the process. Just kind of depends. The public itself, though, if you ask the public and the public has no dog in the hunt, then yeah, the public is going to say yes to that. I agree with you. I totally agree. It's a quandary. It's not a quandary they just bought. I want to make a t-shirt based on something I heard Jimmy Dore say. On the front of the shirt, it would say, I don't want to take your guns away. On its back, but I want to shove them up your ass. Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Yvonne Margolis, public finance elections, they would manage to steal that too. We would need to request UN to come and monitor elections. The problem with that is the American public, at least by large, thinks that the election process is somewhat fair. Understand, you have a large section of the public that bought into this idea that a bunch of Facebook and Twitter ads, more than half taking place after the election itself, having no impact on the election, had some impact, something, or was some kind of influence in the election itself. They're always nebulous with these terms. Look, I think the public buys into the propaganda of our election systems being the greatest in the world and everything else. It takes a while to kind of deprogram yourself from that. So, having the UN to come in to monitor our elections would seem antithetical to most Americans. That's all. But I agree with you on that point. The public, if the public really wanted, if the public actually understood that there was a problem in the way that we go about our affairs on this stuff, and that problem does not begin and end with Russia, that problem begins with us, you may be able to get something changed if you had this kind of campaign like you had in the 50s, 40s. I'm thinking Teddy Roosevelt, but I can't think of the exact time period that Teddy Roosevelt was in, this Trust Buster. Yeah, you can have stuff like that where you have this campaign for this, like where you have people who are advocates for that particular fairness in the process and everything else. It's like, how do you move the crowd, though? How do you get the crowd on your side with that? I don't know, man. I don't know. It's needed, though, until you can have fair and earnest elections, until people can trust those elections. All of this becomes a certain amount of political theater without people being this kind of quagmire. It's like, how do you get yourself out of a system when all the incentives in the system keeps the system the way the system is? It's like, shit, man. Rule of suck, surrogacy. How are you going to get somebody else's rifle up their ass? Yeah, that too, man. That too. I don't know how you're going to pull that one off. That would be difficult to do. All right, guys, this has been over an hour. I am getting hungry, so I'm going to kill this. Guys, thank you all for showing up. Also, everybody who's donated Super Cash, thank you. I appreciate it, guys. Let's see. This was Stephanie Chateau, Brom SL1, and Jim Hayden. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. All right, guys, you all have a good night. And remember, next week on Wednesday, Grant Cameron and Hard Bastard. Both should be damn good. But Grant Cameron is going to be fucking amazing. This is going to be fucking amazing. Thanks, guys.